I want to actually ask you the hard question first, which is what is intelligence and what would it even mean for something to be artificially intelligent?
So I'm really fond of Shane Lake's Marcus Hutter's definition that intelligence is the ability to reach your goals in general environments really well. Now, there is a lot to unpack there. You need to have some goals of some kind, and that is already a little bit of a problematic assumption. Where do you get those goals from? Is that from a programmer or evolution? And general environments are also important because you can totally be well adapted to some very narrow environment and be supremely good at that. But then you get put into outer space or in an aquarium and suddenly you're just flailing around. Many animals work really well in their normal environment, but we're not going to be doing very well on a university course. And finally is, of course, that most of the time this needs to work. It's kind of statistical. But intelligence is environmentally dependent. And I think that is a very important question. Is there some super general intelligence that would work in any environment? And technically, kind of. In practice, no, not really. We are always in an environment, even if that environment is this universe with 3 dimensions and stable matter.
Do you think consciousness is in any way necessary, a necessary condition maybe for intelligence or general or super intelligence, or is consciousness sort of beside the point?
I think it's mostly beside the point, but there is this interesting question, what's consciousness for? So it certainly exists, but it's not entirely clear that it's doing any job. But some people would argue that actually consciousness makes you care about doing things. It actually is part of a process of thinking and experiencing things. Maybe you cannot separate it from the intelligent process. So I'm very much a computational functionalist. I think that the way it feels when information is being processed, that's kind of consciousness. So I think you get consciousness for free. Other philosophers might say, no, Anders, that's totally wrong. Only certain conditions can have it. Or panpsychists go, no, everything is conscious. It's just that the glass of water and the table are not doing particularly much with the consciousness.
So I'm not sure I understood that. Are you saying that consciousness, in your view, is something like the experience of thinking or the experience of processing information? Or?
So I tend to think that when information gets processed, there is perhaps a conscious experience. Mm-hmm. But that in itself is not enough. It needs to be tied together. We're talking about consciousness right now. It has had a causal effect on the world in some mysterious way that makes us spend energy on understanding it, going to consciousness conferences, writing books about it. That is interesting. And it shows that it's not just pure experience that doesn't do anything except getting experience. In fact, it's tied together to what we're doing with the world and our minds.
So some people, I'm thinking of some of your and even my former colleagues at Future of Humanity, Uehiro Center in Oxford, people like Julian Savulescu, Ingmar Persson, fellow Swede, have argued that we shouldn't enhance cognition. And they were thinking more biological human enhancement until we solve the alignment problem. And again, they were not talking about artificial intelligence, but human intelligence. So we should maybe morally enhance people before we worry about cognitive enhancement. Do you share that view? Do you think there's anything to that view? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think they arrived at that view after hearing me and Nick Bostrom go on a lot about the potential for cognitive enhancement and also going on about existential risk. And then they kind of added 2 plus 2 together and realized, if we're going to get very smart and very powerful, but we're still that unwise and immoral, the world is going to explode. Right. And I kind of see that point, except that it's actually fairly hard to increase intelligence. It's not at all trivial to enhance cognition in a useful way, which means that actually by the time we can do that it's going to take a lot of time. And that process might also lead to moral enhancement. After all, if you want to function better as a moral agent, one of the things you might want is to foresee the consequences of your action. That's kind of a form of intelligence. That's a kind of essential part of intelligent acting. You also want to be able to figure out what actions, what effects they have on other people, having a bit of empathy. Even if you're actually ruthlessly selfish, you still need to figure out how other people respond to you, even in your selfish aims. And most people aren't selfish, so they are going to use their intelligence to make the loved ones happier. And finally, we want to control our actions better. If I intend to do something, I want to make myself actually do it instead of saying tomorrow. I'm going to be virtuous tomorrow, but now I'm going to eat my chocolate and do something else. Ideally, I want to live according to my goals. That may be not an intelligence enhancement, but is a form of cognitive enhancement that's really useful both on your job, but also for being a moral person. Yep. You might still, of course, need other aspects to want to be a virtuous person.
So I want to turn to a hypothesis that your colleague coined, I think it was Nick, the vulnerable worlds hypothesis. So can you tell us what is the vulnerable worlds hypothesis, and does augmenting cognition either through artificial intelligence or biological intelligence, does it make that problem worse or better?
So the vulnerable world hypothesis is basically that there exist certain technologies or ideas that are tremendously dangerous. So we have had some technologies that have been mostly beneficial, we have had some that are being really beneficial like vaccines, and there are some that are kind of really problematic like nuclear weapons. And Nick's metaphor is that we're kind of pulling out balls from an urn, and sometimes we get a ball that is bright white and sometimes we get a dark one. But what about a black ball? A really dangerous technology that could destroy the world. Like an easy way of making black holes in your kitchen, or a way of making nuclear weapons using the tools in a normal electronics store.
Or misaligned AI, I suppose.
Yes. Yeah. So here, as Michael Nielsen called them, kind of recipes for doom. These ideas or systems that could really devastate the world. They might not necessarily blow up the world, but they might make it impossible to run a large civilization. And we don't know if they can exist. We have some suspicions that they could in principle exist because we know about bioweapons, and we have suspicions that underlying the superintelligence is dangerous. So there is a reason to believe that just drawing balls willy-nilly from this urn might bring up a black ball sooner or later. Because there is a kind of technology completion conjecture. Eventually, people will realize all possible technologies. And at that point, you need some way of handling it. Maybe some way of putting it back in. Maybe a way of coordinating. Let's never disseminate this dangerous information, or let's get everybody to not use this dangerous piece of technology. That's easier said than done. Nick's point is that in the current kind of semi-anarchic system of nations, if one nation discovers this technology, the others can maybe gang up on them. But it's a tricky coordination problem even on that side. And in many cases, you can't even point at one nation. It's just that everybody needs to work together to keep this thing back in the urn. And that's the vulnerable world hypothesis. We're living in a world that is vulnerable, and right now we don't have any good mechanism for safeguarding. Is this true? That is a good question. I think there could be dangerous technologies. Indeed, I believe that is pretty likely. But the nature of these balls is not as trivial as we're just randomly drawing technologies out of an urn. Some of them are connected to each other. We kind of know what we're looking for. So when somebody is developing a vaccine, they might then be wanting to make a better vaccine, and that's connected to other things in that vicinity. Some balls might also be reflective. They might actually be bright or dark depending on their context. We have probably more control over this process than Nick assumes in a simple example. But that still doesn't mean much if there is a lot of people drawing balls from the urn. Some of us are conscientious, we hope. We are trying to just do the best. And others are just trying to find a ball that's going to make them rich, even if that's a very dark and dangerous one. Yeah. So the question is, if we buy this hypothesis, what do we do? And it seems like we might need some form of global coordination about this risk. And this is where people get very nervous, because global coordination, that might mean that you have very powerful entities in the form of states or in supernatural organizations doing things. And many of us, for good reasons, are skeptical of that. After all, when it comes to killing people, states are actually one of the most dangerous technologies. It's kind of pandemics and states acting badly against their own or other citizens that have killed the most people.
Or saved the most people.
Yeah, that's the tricky part too. Similarly, you might say some of this technology you might handle by global surveillance. And again, we all shiver. Oh, that sounds really creepy. But there are some forms of surveillance that we are actually happy with. Disease surveillance quite often involves that we're just trying to monitor what viruses are churning around. that's not against anybody's privacy most of the time. It's actually something we all agree on is really good. And maybe we could have a sensor in every room on planet Earth detecting whether somebody is gathering fissile material for a nuclear weapon. And for anybody, they would probably say, okay, that's fine, put it in my bedroom. I'm not doing anything in my bedroom that requires that much plutonium. So in that case, that is not an infringement of my privacy. But many people, of course, have a well-deserved concern, but well, then you might have put in those sensors and then you might misuse them. And we need to come up with ways of controlling the most dangerous technology of all. Governments, states, governments, and surveillance, they're also technology, and it's a fairly dark ball.
Yeah. Well, I am working at a genetic startup, as you know, and so I thought I'd ask you a couple questions about embryo selection using polygenic scores and maybe editing, these kinds of things. So first of all, what do you see the advantages of as being for not so much selecting against disease, that's fairly obvious, but potentially boosting cognition or moral enhancement? What are the advantages? Why should people even care about that?
Well, why do we care about health in the first place? Why do we care about anything? And generally we need some kind of scale of the good, what we're trying to achieve in life. And most of these scales link various things like friendship, love, being able to help other people, understanding the world. Different philosophy give you different lists. But it's pretty obvious that without good cognition, you're not going to do a lot of these things. Partially because the lists were made by philosophers, of course, pre-selected for being slightly brainy. But actually, even in love, it's a good idea to be smart because you can come up with way better love songs and the ways of cheering up your loved one. So cognition is useful for most life projects. And similarly, health is useful for most life projects. Right. There are other enhancements that might be interesting if you have a very particular life project. Maybe you want to be a polar explorer, so you want to have extra blubber and cold resistance. That's great, but if you actually then, as you grow up, decide that, oh, the tropical islands are for me, that blubber is not going to be very useful. So many modifications and changes are only going to work for particular life projects.
Right.
And I think we want to go for the generic ones. Julian coined the term the principle of procreative beneficence. I think that's a good one. You should, all things being equal, try to select for the child that has the best property that works for most life projects. That's a robust thing to do.
And we have this term in economics, all-purpose goods. Sometimes it's contrasted with positional goods, but here I have in mind, in philosophy, all-purpose goods are maybe something like a well-functioning immune system, a well-functioning brain for that matter. Yeah. And these are just the kinds of things that no matter what your particular ends are, they're going to be useful in serving those ends. Yeah. So I assume you would, if you were selecting, you had polygenic scores for various things, you would probably want to boost those all-purpose goods.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then you get to the iffy ones, like sometimes there are personality traits that are useful for some things but bad for other things.
Right.
And that's where it gets tricky, because now you might say, okay, can I do a selection here that my child would approve of 20 years down the line? And in some sense, of course, whatever I do, they have to put up with it. But I'd rather have not have a conversation where they're kind of complaining, Dad, why did you make me such an extrovert? Just look at my crashed love life.
That's right. Yeah, a lot of people think that by selecting which embryo you're going to implant, you're somehow closing off the future. But we've seen this in philosophy. A lot of people have argued, well, wait a minute, it depends what you're selecting for. You might be opening the future more than it would otherwise be.
I certainly think that it would be bad to select for genetic variants that reduced certain possibilities. But generally, being healthy means that you have many options. Mental health typically correlates with your ability to switch gears. You can have many different levels of happiness and different moods, and you can respond to the world in an appropriate manner. While many forms of mental illness, they're fixed. Many forms of disease means that you cannot do certain things. So similarly, intelligence, its general purpose, you can think about many different things, and whether you then use that to catalog My Little Pony characters or write philosophy or love poems or whatever, yeah, that is kind of up to you. So I think you can enhance autonomy this way. The thing is, of course, the kid might wonder, how would I have been if Dad had not done this to me? And there is a question where it becomes legitimate to say that, okay, now I'm exerting too much control, which of course any parent should wonder. Sending off your kid to sports or dance school or chess club or whatever, ideally that should be giving them a taste, and then if they like dancing or chess, they get to do it more. But you should be open that maybe they're actually just interested in maps or doing something else. Bad parenting is when you decide, no, my kid is going to be a really good ballet dancer and I'm gonna make sure he or she is staying in ballet school. That's not gonna work. That is not respecting autonomy.
Bad parenting can occur after birth, before birth, and the best advice is probably be a good parent. It's give your child the right to an open future by nurturing their talents when they are born and allowing them to choose, and before they're born, sort of selecting in favor of general all-purpose goods that enable them to.
And it's non-trivial to do this well. Some of these principles work really well, but then you're actually having to act as a parent. So my dad had a very useful heuristic. He always thought about what would his dad have done, and then he did the opposite, because he was kind of unhappy with his upbringing. And I'm pretty happy with the result. So maybe there is some evidence here that grandfather wasn't the greatest dad. But it's an interesting situation because there's still a lot of cognition going on here, thinking about what would actually be good for a child, even if a child is protesting very, very loudly against it in the moment.
And the truth is a lot of kids are pretty resilient. And
parenting matters less than we like to think. Similarly, genes matters less than we think in many cases. They're a bit like the foundation of a building. They set up a general shape, but what's built on top can be actually quite different and can get rebuilt and remodeled in quite a lot of different ways.
Okay, so maybe this is a final question. You've talked a little bit about some of these traits, cognitive ability, but also affective empathy, cognitive empathy, healthy kind of immune system or a healthy body. So what kinds of, we only have polygenic scores for maybe 25 traits at this point, some disease traits, cognitive ability, height, BMI. But, in the future, in the coming sort of decade or two, we're going to have more and more of these scores that are going to be better. So if you were having a child, and let's put aside for the moment gene editing or some radical new technology, synthetic chromosomes, and you could use polygenic scores to select, what kinds of things would you kind of focus on, look at? How would you prioritize?
One important, getting diseases out of the way, that's the most obvious thing. And general purpose goods like intelligence, yes. There are also things like happiness. I have a very high happiness set point. I'm probably in the 19th percentile or above. This is mostly very enjoyable for me. Mildly annoying quite often for the people around me. But
you're Swedish after all.
Yes, exactly. There's a reason I'm not living completely in Sweden, but in the UK. I kind of lost my Ingmar Bergman gloom. But there is a lot of happiness is good for you. It's enjoyable to be a happy person. I think there is a value in that, and I would like to give that to my child. Now, you can be happy for a lot of different reasons. If you're just happy all the time for no good reason, that might actually not be quite healthy. You want to be flexible enough to respond to the situation, but certainly you want to ensure that the genetics that predispose for unhappiness you might select against that. You might want to select for the happiness. You might also want to select for flexibility in thinking so you can adapt to newer situations and environments, because that's definitely what the future is going to throw at us.
Yeah, and if possible, I mean, there are going to be degrees of, let's say the big five: neuroticism, openness, conscientiousness, and presumably you wouldn't want, even if it were possible, zero neuroticism, because it would probably correlate with that kind of placid happiness where you're satisfied all the time, but you don't never achieve anything.
You want to have the right level of dissatisfaction, but enjoyable dissatisfaction that this isn't good enough, or actually I'm bored with this, I'm going to try to learn something new. Similarly, conscientiousness, usually we tend to think about that as being slightly boring. You're washing your dishes and cleaning up your room. Parents are going to be somewhat happy about that, of course. But it's also a very useful thing. It actually has big effects on life outcomes. And it might also be useful for steering yourself across life. What you want is really to have things that increase your ability to have agency.
Right. That's a good answer. Yeah, I really like that. All right. Well, thank you, Anders.
Well, thank you. This has been so much fun.